Here we are.
Excellent.
Hey, Jorgen, how are you?
Very good. How you doing, Simon?
Good, good, good. Finally able to get together and have a chat about what's something that's really important to me, and I know it's important to you. So yeah, thank you for joining me. So today we're doing a little bit of a chat about continuous improvement and overall team health, and how this is a really important topic to me because I've been working in agile teams for decades, and it seems to be the thing that's always left to last, the thing that's always thought about at the end and not at the start, because we're so busy and focused on the work and what we're producing that we almost think about the team and how we're working together as an afterthought. So when I came across everything that you're doing, I was like, wow, this is really important and seems to be the thing that's always been missing. So that's why, even reading your book, like Unlocking Agility, it filled in a lot of the gaps for me in what I was seeing in the real world. So how did you come to continuous improvement?
Well, I mean, I think you're right. It is one of those things that sort of is usually viewed as an afterthought. But at the end of the day, I think that's really what agility is all about. If people
Hmm.
were to sort of ask me in a very simple way, what is agile? It's really about being better today than you were yesterday. I mean, at the end
Yeah.
of the day, that's what it's about. Doesn't matter what kind of tools you have or processes you use, but at the end of the day, that's what this is about. It's about learning faster and than the competition and keep improving. So yeah, I think this has always been really important. I think it's been one of those underlying things that we sometimes don't talk about explicitly, and sometimes I think it becomes a little bit esoteric and abstract. So I think what I've been
Hmm.
trying to do in my book and also with comparative agility, the tool is to bring this to the forefront, bring this, make it really concrete, in fact, and actionable. Because I think at the end of the day, once people understand what they can do better and where those areas are, I think we can actually take action and do something about it. That's when that sort
Mm.
of, I guess we can call it a culture starts forming. Because
Yeah.
ultimately, that's what it comes down to.
Yeah, and the key word that you use there is change, and that's I agree. That's the heart of agile. I mean, some people say to me, it's the term they use is navigating change at pace, but the point is the change part, where humans aren't so good at change. We sometimes stick to things from the past. We fear for the future. So having an actual culture where change is accepted and it's a part of who we are is actually really, really important and is hard to come by. So.
Yes, it is. I mean, in fact, humans are terrible at change. I think there's been some research coming out that's just really scary. I think this was from a medical study where they found that people, heart patients that come to their doctor, and the doctor would literally say that you're now in dire straits. So unless you make these changes to your diet, you're literally going to put your life at risk.
Mm,
9 out of 10 people will not make the changes in their diet. I mean, even when they know that their life is at risk. So that just tells
mm.
you how difficult it is to change. And
and
imagine
and and
this at scale.
and at worst, like, you can make the change, but then you just go back to the way you were, even though,
Right.
making the change stick, that's really, really important as well. And that requires a regular rhythm and reinforcement of what you're doing is right. So
You're completely right.
yeah.
And that's where that environment plays in. That's why this is so hard to do alone. That's why it's so
Mm,
hard to do for a team. It's really the whole program, the whole organization that needs to be with this. Like from the top, the leadership needs to be part of this too. So
yeah.
that's why agile transformations are so hard.
I agree. Okay, well, let's just jump into, a few. We've prepared some slides to talk to. So let me just share my screen. Uh, where are we? Here. And you can see that, can you?
Yes, now I can.
Okay, great, awesome. And where's our little faces down there? But I might just put that down for now so we can see more of the screen. So, and as you said, like, making it a real part of the company, the way you like to put it is make it part of the company's DNA. It is who we are. It's in every cell of who we are to make that we embrace change and we move forward with that. So there's some good reasons behind it. Oh, there's our beautiful faces. So
Yes.
uh, I think we've introduced ourselves, but let's do it again. So Jorgen, you're the co-founder of Comparative Agility and the author of Unlocking Agility, one of the best books on agile transformation I've ever met, and I recommend it to everyone who I talk to. So, um, that goes without saying. And my name's Simon Hilton. I'm an agile coach and head of project management here at a company called Willow, but worked at a lot of the agile transformations in the biggest telcos and grocery stores here in Australia. Okay, so the point here is what we're trying to talk about is that change. And in my eyes, effective and productive teams are the company's greatest asset. But those organizations, those teams and the needs from them are changing all around them. There's a greater demand on employees that, well, employees themselves demand more autonomy and mastery of their career. But also the changing markets around them they need to be able to adapt to those changes quite quickly. And I think what is most telling is this statistic from Harvard Business Review that says that 52%, research shows that since 2000, 52% of companies in the Fortune 500 have either gone bankrupt, been acquired, or ceased to exist as a result of digital disruption. That's a pretty staggering number when you think about it, considering those companies have probably been around for decades upon decades before, but nearly half of them have disappeared in the last 10 to 15 years, because this was released in 2017. So, and really what they're putting it down to is change and being able
Yes.
to adapt to change.
Exactly, and I think what part of what this underscores is that this whole of agility, the whole idea of continuously adapting to change, like you said, it's not a it's not a cool thing. It's not a sort of okay, this is the flavor of the month kind of thing. It's actually a matter of survival. It's no longer something you do just because your competition does it. You do it because if you like to actually continue to exist as an organization, you need to take this seriously.
Yes, I completely agree. And I think there is an element of that when you're talking to people about agility. It's like, oh, this is just a new cool thing, right? And we actually know it's going to happen to everyone, and it's already happening all over the world. So we just want to be on the right side of change than, having change forced upon us. So really leaning into that change is really important.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it's, people sometimes say, and they can be a little bit, I guess, dismissive of this and say, well, change has always been part of life. There's always change. And that's true. There's always been change. But I think the rate of change is what's been happening. And
Absolutely.
that's a lot more aggressive now. And I think the stat you have there is a great example of it. I mean, it used to be that you could be a company and you can be in operations for generations. You could be a company
Hmm.
that was 50, 60, 70 years old, and that would not be that uncommon. In fact, that was the average age on the Fortune 500 a few years ago. And now that average age of a company on the Fortune 500 is down to about 15, 16 years. So it tells
Hmm.
you that it's just a lot more disruption out there. There's a lot more change, a lot more volatility. And if you don't take that seriously, you're going to be at risk of bankruptcy or other worse things.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's funny that you say the last 15, 16 years, because even though we don't like to focus too much around the tools that we use and being around technology, that really is the rise of information and the internet. It is the change, the world going faster, and the exponential growth of technology that's driving a lot of this. And the thing, if you know anything about the exponential curve, it's like it only gets faster. Change only happens faster. So it's important to be able to feel comfortable with that change and to ride that wave, because I believe we're at the beginning. We're not at the end of this kind of trend. And you can already see that in many industries, like with cloud environments now turning physical things into software, infrastructure as code, but also automation, robotics, that kind of stuff. So that being comfortable and accepting that change is going to be important, as you point out, to basically surviving in the new business era.
I think you're completely right. In the internet being one thing, the mobile being another thing. I mean, we're always
Hmm.
connected. There is no such thing as not being connected anymore. And and,
Yep.
and cloud technologies, been a lot of hype around that, but I think there's a lot of truth to the fact that we always now have access to everything we need at all times. So things
Hmm.
that we usually could have taken days before is now taking seconds, and that's going to have an effect on decision making.
And that's the key I try to point out to teams I'm working with as well. So it's about information flow. All of those technologies are about information flow. And these days, the cycles of learning are much lower. So
Yes.
I can actually build something, I can have it out to a customer, and I can learn for what happened all within a day if I have the right technologies at my hand. I mean, that was never really possible before. I mean, before we had, okay, we're going to set up a marketing focus group. We're going to invite a whole bunch of people in a room. We're going to do this kind of stuff. That could take weeks for information to flow, but these information flows are happening faster and faster. And teams have this stuff at their fingertips these days. The ability to uh, get data, visualize data, use data. I mean, that's where those decisions are able to be made every day. But I think the point that we're making here is that change is happening. You can't stop it. It's actually going to be. It's already a part of everyday life, and it's almost a core skill of the modern era in business, in life, in everything. Change is going to be constant, and being able to ride that is success.
I think you're completely right. And one thing that I think is really scary for many people, but also very liberating, is that you don't know how that change is going to happen. You don't know what the
Yes,
impact of that change is going to be. I think we are used to living in sort of a plan-driven world where we can say that, okay, because of this, then this is going to happen, and you can plan for that. I think what we're seeing now is that all these unforeseen things are in fact happening because of this. And we could not have foreseen it up front. So how do you solve that? How do you make sure that you insert in a sense can kind of embrace that uncertainty? And I think that's at the core of what agility means. It's sort of being comfortable with ignorance in the sense that I don't know what I don't know, and I'm okay with that because I'm going to learn it fast.
yeah. I remember someone saying something similar, being comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Yeah,
So
right. Right.
it's okay.
Yeah. That's actually kind
Yeah,
of liberating. Once you can get comfortable with that idea, it's actually liberating. Once you sort of can let go, and because that's sort of what it entails. You have to let go, knowing that you just can't
I
control
agree.
everything.
Exactly. And I think it's important knowing that some things will stay fixed. Not everything will change all the time. There's always going to be things that will be fixed. But knowing what you know and what you don't know is incredibly liberating as well.
Completely agree, and it's going to affect every industry. That's the thing. I think, yes, you're probably right that there's certain things like the laws of physics probably will stay more or less the same, but
Yeah.
all that being
People will
said,
always want low prices. People
right.
want fast shipping, all that kind of
I
stuff.
think
Yeah.
that those are probably true. Yeah, I think that's probably the case. But then that all being said, every industry is going to be affected, and some industries
Agreed.
will be affected sooner than others. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
obviously the book industry and publishing and things like that. But you can also see the educational industry, the utilities industry. Every single industry is going to be affected by this. We just don't know exactly how, but it is just a
Mm-hmm.
matter of when. So the sooner you can get on board with this, and I think that's what's been so exciting about the agile industry, if you want to call it that. It's like, it sort of started in software because that's where I think the cost of change was relatively low. So we understood as software developers that change was sort of part of developing a product. You just
Mm-hmm.
couldn't go from plan to design to develop and then expect no change. We realized overall that that didn't work. But that now has been permeating other ways of thinking, like HR, like finance, like facilities for that matter. I think we all understand now that that thinking, that agile thinking is something that we all have to sort of embrace.
Yes. Okay, cool. I think that this was one of the quotes which I really liked, which kind of exemplifies that, understanding that change is not just happening with your industry, it's happening everywhere. Is that if the rate of change on the outside exceeds the rate of change on the inside, the end is near. And that really rang true to me, because if the world outside you is changing and you're not taking notice, and even changing personally, irrelevance is just around the corner.
Right.
And I do think one of the industries, you pointed out, like publishing industries are key parts of this. I mean, I personally experienced TV stations, newspapers, all those kinds of stuff who thought, oh no, we don't have to worry about this change stuff. We're fine. We've been around forever. We'll continue to be around forever. And it only took under a decade for those industries to be severely changed. So it's not okay to just be insular and say we're okay, we're special, we're different, because the world is increasingly connected. The world is someone's increasingly able to do better jobs with better tools, better technologies, better people. So it's important to be able to uh, see that change in the world and be a part of it. Actually, lean into it. That's what I'm trying to say here.
That's right.
Not just stick your head in the sand and say, well, we're special. Won't happen to us. No, you've got to be a part of that interconnected world.
Part of what makes this really hard is because you might actually be making quite a bit of good money on the existing way of doing
Yes.
things. So you're sort
Yes.
of asking yourself to, they always say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, And
Mm-hmm.
now you actually are in a case where you say, okay, it ain't broke, but now we have to fix it still. Like we still have to
Yeah.
anticipate that this will be broke at one point. And that's really hard because your organization is in many ways optimized for exploiting that particular business model or that particular
Mm.
way of making money, and you're doing really well at it. And then at the same point you're saying, okay, we're doing great. Our numbers are all pointing in the right direction. Now let's disrupt ourselves. And that's
Mm.
really, really hard. That goes
And
against.
that takes a lot of courage. It
It
does. Yeah.
does. It takes a lot of courage. It goes against every antibody in your organization. It goes against your very culture, and in fact can also be painful in terms of shareholders. They may actually look at
Hmm.
you and say, "What are you doing?" And that's why
Hmm.
certain companies, like Amazon, I think is a great example of that. They actually do on purpose disrupt themselves, and are very open about it and say, hey, our short-term profits may take a hit here, but we know this is the best for us as a long-term strategy. And it took a while, but now, look at Amazon. They're doing quite well.
Yeah. And a part of that is you're also willing to cannibalize profitable businesses
Right.
if new ones come up.
Right. That's exactly right. And I think a really interesting case. A lot of this thinking comes from Dr. Clayton Christensen. Disruptive innovation. And I
Mhm.
was fortunate to study on him a little bit at Harvard, and he was telling me how Harvard University, were frightened about what was going to happen in the next several years. They said, we don't really have a great alternative right now to our current business model. We're making tons of money for all these students coming in, paying a lot of money to go to this school. Yes, we have a great brand, but before the case was nobody could get the information you got. Except
Yes.
at Harvard, because we had
Yes.
these libraries that are amazing, we have these professors that are amazing. Those are still true, but you can now get access to that information anywhere in the world now. It's not like you
Mhm.
can go and say that, oh, I learned something in this particular school and nobody else has access to that information. It's open, it's there for everyone. So then how do you make the case that the value proposition is worth it, that you need to pay these enormous amounts of money, and then still say, okay, I'm learning the same from another school at a fraction of the cost. And how can you make that case? It's tricky. And then they're also now experimenting with online learning, and what are the pricing models around that. It's a really interesting situation. They're being disrupted themselves, but I think that
Mhm.
the benefit they have is that they know they are. I think a lot of people don't realize it yet.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting what you're saying there, because I think a lot of how could you put it, traditionally stable companies have always been about holding back and saying, we've got it, no one else has it, but the world's becoming increasingly more open. And it's, if you do hold back, it's the perfect opportunity for someone to disrupt by doing something smaller, cheaper, easier, and then slowly working their way up that value chain. Um, for example, with Kodak, I mean, we're the ones who have all the film. We do film. No one else can do that, right? But it only took time for digital cameras to eat their way up the value chain to decimate that industry.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the funny part about that story is that they invented the digital photography.
Yes.
I mean, that's the thing that's so.
Yeah.
I mean, it's amazing. They actually had these brilliant engineers come up with groundbreaking
Yes.
technology, several decades before it became a standard, and they were actually shut down because it
And this
disrupted their own model.
and this comes back to that same point. Like they had it in their hands, but they weren't willing to disrupt the golden goose,
That's right.
which they already had. I can imagine what kind of company Kodak would be now if they actually, had taken that on. They would have been,
Exactly.
would have been
Exactly.
everywhere. So yeah, okay. So one thing that's really important to notice about what's happening here is that, I mean, change is happening all over, but a part of that also is that information is becoming much more spread out and in the hands of the people on the front lines. So the structures inside teams are changing as well. The authority structures we used to have of command and control, where the executives were at the top, middle managers in the middle, and the staff on the floor doing the bottom, telling everyone what to do. The world is operating at too fast a pace, and we have the rise of the knowledge worker to deal with as well. This isn't a just case of um, uh, do what I tell you, but as you kind of pointed out actually quite before, there's a lot of unknowns. So it's hard to tell people do this when you don't know what it is. So it's important for people to have a problem solving ability, to be able to lean into that unknown and actually create positive outcomes. And that's why the authority and hierarchy structures have almost been flipped on their head here, with the staff being the most important people on the front line who are actually solving problems for customers. And it's more of a enablement and empowerment that the executives and managers do to help those people lean into that unknown.
Yeah, I completely agree. And part of it, I think the tricky part here is that you kind of have to do a little bit of both, because when people
Yes.
sometimes say what is the What do you mean by business agility? I think the shortest phrase I came up with was embrace change, execute with purpose. And what I
Hmm.
mean by that is that, yes, you have to embrace change. Yes, you have to be adaptive and all those things. Just the things that people always think about when they think of agility. But you also have to execute on those proven business models. You can't just sort of say,
Yes.
oh, we're Kodak, and now we're just going to give up traditional film just like that.
Yes.
You can't do
Yeah.
that either. You have to be able to actually do both. You have to be able to, yes, we're going to embrace this digital technology, and we're going to be able to, we can still exploit what we're doing here in film technologies,
Yeah.
doing those both things. And that's the tricky part. That, in fact, is agility, being able to balance those two. And I think that's what you're showing here with those hierarchies and those authority structures. You have to, in a sense, be able to do both those sort of things, because one is probably more appropriate than the other in a given context. If you
Hmm.
have a very clear business model, it's proven out, the customer is known, the value proposition is known, there's not a lot of innovation, it's mostly just incremental innovation, then a relatively, I mean, I'm not going to say top down, but more of a plan driven way of working could be
Yes.
appropriate. But
Yes.
like you were saying, if you're being disrupted, that's certainly not the way to work and not the way to operate.
Hmm.
So balancing those two is what I think a lot of organizations are struggling with.
Yeah, you hear that. I mean, I think I've heard some people call it explore and exploit, and they
Right,
do
right.
have very different ways of working and almost very different cultures, as we're kind of pointing out here,
Yes,
because they're almost inverted. But how do you get those two to operate inside the same company to provide the resources and capital that you'll need? And that's a funny thing. They're almost symbiotic, aren't they? Because to explore, you need the resources and the capital to kind of do that, but you can't do that forever because eventually you need to move on into the future.
that's right. And as you do the exploration phase, you get to a point where you want to sort of factorize everything and say, all right, now we understand the value proposition, we have a product solution fit. Now it's a matter of scaling this. And then it's great if we already then have a way to do this. We have a marketing engine, we have sales staff, we have operational efficiencies. Then the exploitation comes in, and that's wonderful if you already have that machine built, because that's not easy either. So you're right, it can be very symbiotic, but it can be very destructive. I've been fortunate or unfortunate to have been in environments where this has worked quite poorly. And
Hmm.
I shouldn't probably mention the name of the companies, but there were large Fortune 500 companies that I worked for that
Hmm.
were acquiring other smaller companies who were very innovative. The idea being
Ah,
that, hey,
yes.
let's acquire this company and let's take advantage of this great technology and become innovative. And instead, what we saw is that our sort of mothership culture basically smothered that little startup and killed that
Mm.
innovation that was there. And I think that happens very often.
Oh, I've witnessed it personally, so I know exactly what you're
Yeah,
talking
you know
about.
what I'm saying.
Um, I think the point we're trying to make with this slide, though, is that the model on the left is fairly traditional,
Yes,
but the model on the right is very new, and it clashes with a lot of the classic business structures, including HR, you know, payroll, incentives, even performance management. All those kinds of things are literally turned on their head when you have the model on the right of enable and empower, because there is a lot of freedom and uh, fast failure that needs to happen. People need to make mistakes in order to learn from the future. So these different models are forming, and being on the right is the things that are changing right now are, one, the technology, the organizations, but also the teams and how they operate within them.
exactly. No, I completely agree with you. And then this is the hard part. This is the stuff that we haven't
Exactly.
we don't really, this is not where the consulting firms can just come in and say, here's how you operate, because they
Yeah.
don't have any experience with this either. So in fact, they're being disrupted, their entire model is being disrupted. So this is
Hmm.
why I think we as sort of agile thought leaders and agile coaches can actually provide a lot of value, because we have some experience in this, not just from a practical perspective, but we have some of the theoretical underpinnings that we already tried. And I think here is where we can help, we can be part of it, having that skin in the game, because we're part of the organization, we feel the pain, to
Yep.
a much greater degree than I think consultants often do. So I think we can add a lot of value here.
I agree. So just one last point on the teams is that when you are so exploratory, there's a term that's often used. I think it was coined by Netflix of being highly aligned and loosely coupled. What I wanted to point out here was that alignment is really, really important. When teams are not traditionally commanded by a manager or a captain up on high, it's really, really important that they have a clear alignment between them, the customer needs, and the business needs. And that they have enough freedom to operate somewhat independently and move where they need to go, move where the problems are, move where the value is, as long as they're aligning to the overall business value.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think sometimes they call that sort of high autonomy, and high purpose. High purpose is the highly aligned, and then have high autonomy in the sense that you can do, more or less what you want to do within certain guardrails, and that's possible to do as long as you have that purpose that you're all aligned towards. So it's not easy to do this, but once you do it, it can be a beautiful thing because you don't need so many control structures. People all
Yes.
understand why we're here. We understand what we're trying to accomplish. We understand what value is. We understand our customer, and we understand how we can add value. So yeah, I think that's sort of the secret sauce to a lot of that, and that's where, of course, leadership comes in.
Yeah, and I think it comes back to one of the points you were making before about it's not just going in one direction. Actually, you need two different cultures for a company to be really successful. I mean, a lot of people think that Agile, when they first hear about Agile, it's like, wait a minute, you can just do whatever you want and there's no accountability and no documentation. It's like, no, we allow people to solve problems, but within contextual boundaries. And that's where I think these two things this is saying. So highly aligned is in, okay, within these guardrails or in these boundaries, we want you to think as creatively as possible and solve as many problems as possible. And that's where the leastly coupled comes into it.
Yeah, completely agree.
Yeah. So what we have is, and on the next slide, is your 5 pillars of agile transformation that come from your book, Unlocking Agility. First being technology, which is where I think a lot of people think agile just sits at all and it doesn't belong anywhere else. But when you start to actually look deeper into it, to be successful, to not just be an agile team, but to be a successful agile organization, these 5 pillars all become really important. And what people will notice is that only one of them is technology. The rest of it is all organizational design, people, leadership, culture, very traditional and almost foundational parts of any business. The two that we're going to focus on here are people and culture, because they are really at the team level of how you can improve the team over time.
Yeah, this has been one of those. When I first came up with these 5, it was back in 2008, 2009, and I've been trying to battle test these many times, and I haven't really found a better way to articulate, agile transformation in terms of the main pillars. There's 2 underlying parts of this, I can say.
Mm-hmm.
One of those is customer, and the other is purpose. But those are sort of, in a sense, external to this, if you know what I mean. I think these are
Mm-hmm.
the 5 that sort of affects the organization specifically, and then I think the purpose and the customer is sort of what underlines the why behind all of it. And I
Yeah.
think the idea around customer and purpose is interesting because sometimes that can be kind of a what starts first. Does the customer come first or does purpose come first? And that's really interesting because it's not an easy answer to that. I think it depends on the organization a lot. And
Mm.
it's if you ask some people, they always say, oh, we start with our customer. The customer is always right, and that essentially becomes our purpose, to please the customer. And then the other people who will say, well, no, we actually we start with the purpose, and then if a certain customer doesn't believe in that particular purpose, that is okay with us. We
Mm-hmm.
don't want any part of that. A lot of these sort of altruistic, and I think especially when Silicon Valley had a little bit of a, I guess, more of an altruistic view. I think right now we view them more as a pure capitalistic mechanism. But back in the day,
Yes.
when you hear things like "do no evil," right? Google used to say these things. It was purpose, and then all the things that kind of came from that would be, okay, that's our purpose, and then what are the products and technologies and the customers we can serve, knowing that part of our purpose here is to do no evil. I think later on we've seen that may have changed slightly. I'm not saying they do evil on purpose, but you can also see that they will compromise on that when they do business in China, for instance. They'll say, well,
Yes.
privacy is really important, except for when it affects our
Yeah.
bottom line.
Mm-hmm.
But then you have companies in China who are taking a very different tack. For them, very often purpose is secondary. They're thinking we're going to make money, and
Mm-hmm.
that's sort of the point of all of this. And whether or not and how we make money, it all depends on what the customer wants. So they start with the
Mm-hmm.
customer. The purpose is sort of secondary, and that's why you see these You see some of the particular apps, for instance, in China are a lot more diverse and maybe even also confusing to a lot of Westerners. Like you'll see apps that do payment plans. You can buy things. You can do you can do a social media app on it.
Hmm.
I mean, it does everything. Alibaba is a great example of how that has sort of evolved into this uh, vast ecosystem of things. It's not just an Amazon clone or anything like that.
Yeah,
It's an
yeah.
amazing it's an amazing ecosystem. So that's underlying all of this. But you're right. At the end of the day, whether it's purpose or cult or customer that starts it all, to make this concrete and to operationalize this and to embrace change and execute purpose, these 5 pillars ultimately are the ones you need to focus on.
It's funny how you bring that up because when I listen to that, I think of the locus of control of what you can control, what you can influence, what you can't control. And these five seem to be the things that a company can control,
That's right.
or orchestrate or grow or something like that. A customer and a purpose, I put those in the influence bucket because you can't control the customer. They'll do whatever they want, especially if a competitor comes along who has something better to offer. Also, a purpose is something which may be shared amongst you and many other businesses or many other people or many other organizations. So, I mean, all those things are really, really important, but these are the things, these pillars are certainly within the control of a company to enhance their agility and be real guiding the North Stars towards that destination.
Yeah,
Well,
I
actually, I shouldn't even
completely.
say
it,
it's not a destination, it's a journey.
yeah,
So,
exactly. It's a continuous journey, but I completely agree with
correct.
you. That is the purpose. That is the reason, no pun intended,
Yeah,
for enumerating these 5, because these are sort of within the realm of what the company can, if not control, they can at least influence it.
exactly. Right. So the first one is people. And it's I think almost we've talked about it the whole way is that leaning into change. And this is just being okay. The growth and change is a part of life. Growth and change is a part of who we are. It's a part of our DNA. So it's what a lot of people term a growth mindset, but it's really hard to just, I'm really interested in your point of view here because it's really hard just to say someone have a growth mindset. Um, here's your growth mindset card. Now you have a growth mindset. It's something which is quite innate, and that's why it's interesting when you say it's part of the company's DNA. It's got to be part of a person's DNA as well.
Yeah, it does, and I think this is where I think leaders play a really important role, because they in many ways can sort of affect how people are being evaluated, how people are being rewarded, how people are being incented to do certain things. And I think when it comes to growth mindset, Carol Dweck was the professor who came up with that. Part of what she found by doing research in kindergartners and later on in people in middle school was that, if you praise people for being smart, it's like, oh, you're such a smart person. um, that could be have a temporarily positive effect, but ultimately that person became very frustrated and ultimately did not become a very high performer, because the person then essentially had a fixed mindset in the sense that, okay, I'm smart, that's why I'm good, and then if I can't figure something out, well, then maybe I'm not smart enough. And you can't really change intelligence. Like, you're either smart or you're not so smart. I mean, it's not so much you can do about that particular part. You just kind of feel like you're failing because you're not smart enough. But if you praise someone because they work hard and you said, hey, you did really well, you worked really hard on that, it changed quite a bit of things, because what happened then is that the person would say, oh, the reason I succeeded is because I worked hard, and I kept getting better and better. And then when things started getting tough later on in life, these people who had sort of grown up with that type of mindset, they would say, well, okay, I didn't make this work, I am having some challenges. Well, you know what? That just means I need to work harder. And it means I need to try some more. And even though I failed here, I can try again. And I learned from that failure. And I could keep trying. And it was more of an experimental, more of a learning mindset that Carol Dweck discovered by being able to sort of praise the idea of learning, as opposed to you're smart, that's why you're succeeding. And I think that's a really interesting way of looking at things. And I think Nadia Satella has been the person who's probably maybe the one who's kind of popularized this in business. He used this very consciously at the transformation with Microsoft, being very
Hmm.
clear that We're going to embrace this idea that if you fail along the way, it doesn't mean that you don't have the ability. It just means that we need to work harder in terms of learning faster so that we can continuously evolve the way we think of these problems, and not just say that, oh well, you couldn't make it work because you weren't smart enough,
Hmm.
because you weren't good enough. It became, I guess this goes very nicely with psychological safety, because it then becomes safe to fail. Because if you
Mm.
fail, it's not because you're stupid. You failed because you didn't try the right thing, or because you need to just try again. It
Yes.
becomes less dangerous to not get the right answer right away. And I think that's very often what it comes down to.
I forget who it was. I think it was Bill Gates who said, if you want to double your success rate, double your failure rate.
Yeah, I think
Um,
it's a very good saying. I like that.
and I think that's what a lot of people don't understand. Well, I see that when I'm coaching teams, is that there's almost a assumption that failure is bad, and I
Yes.
will be punished at my work if I fail. And this, I'm not. Let's not just put this down to a team level. I mean, that can be reinforced by behavior and leadership. If you want to create a change culture and a culture where learning and growth is important, just as important is the ability to fail and learn. In fact, I would say it's almost mandatory.
Hmm.
The thing that people are afraid of is that you're just going to fail. But if you build a failure and learning culture, that's the virtuous cycle.
That's exactly right. And we should be clear, this isn't, we're not talking catastrophic failure here. I mean, there
No,
is
it's
there
managed risk.
that's exactly right. There is, what David Snowden likes to call safe to fail experiments.
Hmm.
You make a failure in a relatively controlled area where you do an experiment, and you know that if you fail here, that's maybe call it a temporary setback, but there's also learning that comes with that, and then you move on. It's not like you go all in on a huge business strategy that has never been tested and then say, okay, let's go and see if we fail, no big deal. I mean, that could put
Hmm.
the whole company at risk. So,
Yes.
people need to understand that this is not, this is intelligent failure. Let's put it this way, and it
Hmm.
is something that's done in a strategic way. So I think that's one important thing. The other part of it is also that this has to be modeled by leaders. It has to be modeled by people that are the role models of the organization, and that's why, when something happens where things can go bad, and they do sometimes it could be big failures. The way leaders react to that is extremely important. And I think, again, not to use Amazon for all of these examples, but I do think they do some good work here. You remember the Fire Phone? I'm sure the
Hmm.
Amazon Fire
Yes.
Phone,
Yes.
colossal
Yes.
failure, right? I mean,
Absolutely.
one
Massive failure.
one
Yeah.
of those, and there's a couple of friends of mine who work there, and I asked them, what happened to that team who worked on the Fire Phone? And he said, you know what? First of all, none of them got fired. They were all kind of viewed as sort of, internal heroes. And not that, yeah, oh, great, you failed. It wasn't really that. It was more like, hey, you did the best you could, didn't work out, no big deal. But what happened was a lot of the technology that they used in the Fire Phone later on got used in the Echo. And most of the
Mm.
people now are now working on the Amazon Echo project, which is, of course, one of their
Yes.
biggest AI projects
Yes.
going on at the moment. So it worked out really well for them, and I think that that tells a story that other employees look at and they say, "Whoa, what if I'm on this project and it fails? What does that mean? Am I dead? Is my career over?" No,
Hmm.
not at all. You are now part of an amazing project that spurred lots of other technologies, lots of this particular technology. The Fire Phone failed, yes, but
Yes.
the speech recognition technology that you developed here we use now in Echo, and that works great.
Hmm.
And the recognition you used in terms of the visual representations and the 3D technology, we can use that for other things. So it's that kind of attitude that I think Bezos has been so good at instilling into Amazon. That I think makes the people safe to fail at Amazon. It's not something that they're afraid of.
And it almost feels like it's a part of their business model.
It
It's the
is.
only way that they move forward. So, yeah, I think I remember hearing about that example as well, about how it basically gave birth to Alexa, which is almost one of their biggest products these days.
That's
So
right. That's right.
it's
Yeah,
yeah.
without Alexa and the Echo technologies, I mean, they're now going into a whole different area that, and they're leading. I mean, you see Google coming in, you see Apple coming in there as well, but they're clearly market leading in that area, and that's really a lot based on the technology that they learned from the Fire Phone.
Mm. And another part of people another part of people inside your pill is just embracing that diversity within teams. And we're not necessarily talking about demographic diversity, but diversity of opinion, diversity of skills, in order to get a uh, a better understanding of problems and how to solve them coming in. And I think it comes down to a slightly bit more of a lateral thinking technique, where there's many different ways you could solve this problem, but it doesn't necessarily, it's not really apparent on the first viewing of it. So it's important to think about the problem in much of a broad way to come to the best solution.
Yes, I completely agree. And this is the beautiful thing about, about agility, is that we understand that what we're trying to do here is to learn. And to learn, you need to have a broad marketplace of ideas. You need to have a
Mm-hmm.
broad perspective. And you just don't get that if everyone talks the same, thinks the same, looks the same.
Yep.
You need to come from different schools. You need to come from different countries. You need to perhaps speak different languages. I think it's beautiful that you may look different, you may think different, you may approach problems differently. All of these things are actually very beneficial. Now we should be clear, because I think sometimes people think we go overboard sometimes, and we say, oh, the diversity is the answer to everything.
Yep.
Diversity is not necessarily the most effective way to solve problems when they are simple problems to solve. And I think
Yes.
that's where the research has been pretty clear. If you're trying to build a bridge or something, you're probably not going to do great by having a bunch of basket weavers and people who have nothing to do with
Yep.
building bridges. uh, you'll
Yes.
bring in those architectural engineers and you'll probably do better. But in complex situations like we're dealing with here, when we're talking
Mm-hmm.
about not knowing, right, this is the whole idea of embracing the thing you
Yes.
don't know.
Yeah.
Then you need that diversity of thought, and that means that you might not be that doesn't mean that you'll build the solution the quickest, but you will build the best solution and you will build the
Mm.
most innovative solution. And that's where that diversity is so beautiful. So yeah, I'm a big proponent of that. I mean, there's elements of diversity that we haven't even talked about much that I think now is getting more attention, like neurodiversity. The whole
Yep.
idea that people perhaps with Asperger's or things that we may look at as an impediment in a way, can actually be a great benefit.
Mm.
And diversity of education. Some of the best developers I've ever had on my team are from music backgrounds. Like their major was in music, and they were
Yes.
wonderful developers. And it wasn't because they did a traditional computer science background. It was the thinking behind it that mattered. And I guess music and computer science has quite a bit of analogies with each other. So
Yeah, I think there is, and it reminds me of I forget, I don't know if it's a book or just a term, but great artists steal, and it feels almost like change isn't necessarily a situation of bringing unknowns out of the ether, but bringing diverse ideas together to create something new.
that's right.
And that's where that when we talk about diversity, I mean, you could say, okay, you've got someone who's from this musician background and this person's from a software background. When they put these two different backgrounds together, what new thing is formed? That's what we're trying to talk about here. And that may fail, obviously, but after many tries, you'll probably hit on something which actually is new in the world, probably hasn't been done before, and solves the customer problem.
Especially then if you have that alignment that you talked about, and that
Yeah.
autonomy, so they're actually free to be themselves at work, and they understand why they're there, and they all believe in the mission, they believe why they're there is important, and they want to solve that problem together.
Mm-hmm.
Then that could be a really powerful combination.
Mm-hmm. And it's going to be that new direction of a problem, not just a next version of a currently existing thing. It may be that, but sometimes it's actually going to be a completely different direction for that problem.
Yes,
Which I mean, the five phone's a great example, as you said before. Like that was just basically with phones had been done before, but just the way that they thought about it with the speech recognition and stuff actually took that whole product line in a different direction, which um, created what we have today.
that's exactly right. And this is also where I think our traditional hiring practices are going to be challenged, because I'm not sure if you're going to get that type of diverse skill set. I don't think you're going to get people with growth mindsets, for instance, if all you do is go to a college campus, bring in a bunch of people, look at resumes, do
Yes.
an interview, and then make a decision. There might be other ways to identify talent than we're used to.
Well, this is the interesting point. As authority, decision making, and accountability moves closer towards the team, so does they need to be in charge of their destiny in some respect. So agile teams probably want to be, I mean, the whole idea of creating a cohesive team, a diverse team, all those kinds of things. You need to understand who's in your team, what gaps do you feel you have. Therefore, the team would probably be more involved in the hiring process than usual. They're not just going to have someone parachuted and dropped in. By the way, here's your new team member. See you later from HR. It's going to be much more of
Exactly.
a consultative collaboration with HR to fill out the team in the way that they see the team, the direction they're going.
I think you're totally right, and perhaps even more important than their skills, it might actually be the way that they're able to cooperate and the way they're able to
Mm,
collaborate with each other, because you as a team you'll be able to grow in skills, knowledge, and abilities over time. But if you can't collaborate, a lot of that goes away. A lot of the benefit of these other skills goes away if you can't collaborate with
mm.
other people. So that's really important. There's going to be a lot more emphasis, I think, on that communication, collaboration, those kind of things.
I would be interested also in, just in the same way we're talking about companies disrupting themselves, teams disrupting themselves with people with different ideas, different histories to disrupt any sort of groupthink so they can actually continue that growth journey.
Yeah, no, it's curious, and sometimes you see teams, sort of self-organizing where they can actually say, well, we've been now a team for 6 to 8 months. We feel like we need a change, and they will invite other teams to come in, and they will say, hey, how about we start mixing a little bit? Maybe I can work on your team for a couple of months, and then you can work on my team, and we can see if that changes the dynamic, and it typically does. So as long as that's a safe thing to do, as long as that doesn't affect your career in any negative way, your manager doesn't get mad at you. As long as you create that environment where that's
Yes.
okay to do, then I think some really beautiful things can happen. And I've seen that.
Well, I think that's one of the core HR principles at Google is that if you're not happy with your team or you want to go somewhere else, they will find you somewhere else to go.
That's right.
Um, they make it very important to find the good people, but let them move around, pollinate ideas across the organization, and create that diversity of thought.
That's right. Yeah, I completely right, and I understand that it's when you get hired at Google and many companies like that, you don't really get hired for a particular role or a particular position. You really get
Mm,
hired as a person because we realize this is a person that we want to be part of our team, whatever that team ends up being, and whatever that function ends up being. We don't know yet. It's going to change over time, but we know that
yeah,
this is a person we want to have as part of our organization.
yeah. And the next pillar we want to talk about is culture. Now, this is a very nuanced word across the world, across companies, all those kinds of things. But the culture model you talk about in your book is this one by Schneider. Just give us a walkthrough of this, please.
Yeah, so Schneider, he William Schneider, he wrote a book called The Re-Engineering Alternative, and essentially what he was doing, he was looking at different companies. He was looking at the way that they structure themselves, what type of leadership they have, and he sort of came up in a very simple way. He came up with an idea of looking at the way the people were rewarded, the way the leadership was communicating value, the way they were recognizing value over time, and also looking at how companies can kind of grow that. And so he was trying to classify it, not saying that one is exactly one or the other. There's always some dominance here, but he was able to sort of uh, classify it into a couple of different key components, I guess you can call it. And I thought it was really interesting how he did it. So the four components he had was the first one I think he called the cultivation, or he called it a cultivation culture, where the idea here was about enablement. It was about working together as a team. It was really kind of an interesting, the way he looked at it was kind of like a coach, a person who's in a cultivation cult is charismatic, is inspiring.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought that was really interesting, and very often he would talk about that as a way to inspire people to go above and beyond things like that. And we've heard about companies that are in the cultivation realm, if you will. I think Apple under Steve Jobs is probably a good example of someone who would be there.
Yeah.
Then there would be competence culture, which would be a typical sort of well, the smartest person in the room is the one who makes the decision. We only hire the best and the brightest, and at the end of the day, it's the data and the smartest person who rules. I think
Mhm.
Google typically comes in that category. They, the way they hire people is very often through algorithms and word problems and things like that.
Yep.
University environments could be another situation where a competence culture might be ruling. And sometimes you hear situations where maybe a superior officer will have a certain opinion, and then someone who's inferior to him or her from a rank perspective could actually say, hey, here's what I've seen and here's my data to back it up, and that person will actually win the argument because of that. That's a
Yes.
typical example of a competence culture. And then
Mhm.
control culture is what we probably look at as more traditional top-down management. That's kind of
Mhm.
where, military is a typical example of a control culture, although I think that's starting to change as well, where the
Mhm.
idea is that the person with the highest rank, the person with the most experience is the person you will follow. You don't really question that. Like you don't want necessarily a corporal to declare war on Russia. Not a good idea. You probably want
Yeah.
that to be going up
Mhm.
the ranks. So before you do anything drastic, so that would be an example of that. The control culture being very top down and sort of structured and very clear in its sort of ranks. And then the collaboration culture, which is something that I think has gotten a lot more traction lately, which is really the leader as the coach. It's really about integration of ideas. It's the idea of creating customer value through having really deep collaboration between people from different areas. I think they talk about sometimes sports teams can fall into that category, and I think sports teams are actually not a bad analogy to agile organizations, because talk about a diverse set of skills. Each of these people on whatever team you're thinking of, whether it's American football or soccer or volleyball for that matter, they all have their unique skills, knowledge, and abilities, and you need to somehow make sure you can make this work as a whole. And that's what I think they're talking about in the collaboration culture. What I often do, when I do workshops, is to try to have teams or organizations sort of map themselves against this matrix, and it's interesting to see how that looks, because depending on where you are, sometimes geographically or also inside the given company, you can kind of clearly see that there's a certain heat map that emerges, and you can kind of see where people feel they are, and then you can very often then look at that and say, well, how does that mesh with an agile culture? Because I do think
Yes.
if you're in an organization and you realize you're very deeply in control, for instance, you're probably going to have some challenges trying to move
Mhm.
to a more agile culture. And if you are already in collaboration and cultivation, you can realize, okay, there are probably some benefits we already have here that can work
Mhm.
in our favor. But it's a nice way to sort of, I think, anytime you deal with culture, I think it's good to kind of talk about it and try to make it more concrete, because culture is one of those things you can't see. It's just the way we do work around here. So the more we can
Mhm.
talk about that and make it visible, I think that the more that can help us deal with it and actually do something concrete to help shape it.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of core questions that get asked, or when it comes to culture, is like, how do we resolve conflict? How do we make big decisions? All those kinds of things, which kind of drive to the heart of it. But the point is that there's no right answer. There's many ways of doing things. Yes, there's ways that lend more to agile than others, but it's not. This isn't a scorecard.
No, no, I think you're completely right, and I think you're very right about this too. When you are dealing with conflicts, especially, is when you have these sort of defining moments. I mean, you can put all
Hmm.
these beautiful posters up, right, and you can say that, oh, we're a collaboration culture, or we're this or that, and customer comes first. And then when a conflict happens, or where a situation happens when you need to make tough decisions, I think that's when you define that culture. That's when leaders,
Yes.
for instance, will say very clearly, without maybe speaking any words, what kind of culture we are. So, I mean, I think a classic example, I think it's Tylenol. You probably heard this story of Tylenol. This is, I think it was back in the 80s. There was a person who was tampering with some medication, some Tylenol medication, and I think there was some people who got sick or maybe
Hmm.
even died. So it was a pretty grave situation. But of course, it was a small batch. Now, Tylenol executives heard about this, and what they could have done is they could have maybe said something about, "Oh, we got total control over this. Don't worry. We're putting situations in place to take care of this." But they literally they withdrew all their product from the shelves, and I think it was actually a
Hmm.
nationwide situation where they basically said, we're not going to sell any Tylenol products until we have come up with a new technology, and that was tamper-proof Tylenol
Hmm.
bottles, because we believe that the customer's safety comes first. and
Hmm.
and I think that said a lot. I mean, not only was it a great move, I think from a safety perspective, because it made it very clear that we're not going to tolerate any risk here to our customers, but I think for our employees, I think that said a lot too. Obviously, profit wasn't the first motive here. It really was the safety of their customers and of their patients, I guess you can call them. And I think that said a lot. And the same thing that, like we just said about Amazon, when that
Hmm.
failure happened with Amazon Fire Phone, what Bezos and leadership did there, that's ultimately what tells you, okay, are we a company that is okay with failure, or
Hmm.
are we going to be punished? I mean, that's when the rubber hits the road. So
I
you'll
completely agree.
there are
Yeah.
many examples of that.
Yeah. I think culture can be summarized in some respects of it's when you can say who you are and how you work together. But for me, it's just as you're pointing out, like there's many things that happen day to day where people say, oh, we have beers on Friday afternoon and we, wear Hawaiian shirts on Tuesdays, that kind of stuff. That's what people always often think about the culture. But I do believe and agree with you that it's at those crucial decision-making points about what do we do next, where your culture and your values do come out. And that's what will be remembered by yourself, by your customers, by your employees, everyone.
I think you're totally right. Someone said once that culture is what we do when nobody's watching, and I
Yes,
think that's
exactly.
a really nice way to summarize it, because it's kind of the things that happen when you're not being supervised. Like,
Hmm.
if you're faced with a situation, what do you do? Do you sort of take that shortcut to
Hmm.
get that quick profit? Or do you do the right thing and say, you know what, we're not going to do this now because that isn't the right thing to do, even though we're going to maybe lose money in the short term?
Yeah.
All those decisions, I think, ultimately shapes the culture, and it's one of those things that I think people sometimes don't realize how hard it is to build a culture that, intentionally. And I think that's why HR has such a huge role here. I think the
Yes.
reward structures that we put in, the way we incent certain behaviors, and
Yep.
also punish them, it really affects the culture, because that affects the norms of the company, and that,
Hmm.
and again, affects the behavior, which at the end of the day is what the culture is.
Hmm. I completely agree. And I myself have had to collaborate with HR on, because there is such a crossover between um, team kind of health and employee health, and the the edges are bleeding quite a lot. But it's important that culture is something that's where actions follow words, and it's not something that's undermined by is lived throughout the organization, not something that's said on the floor but then undermined in private. It has to breathe throughout the organization.
Yeah, completely agree. And
Yeah,
it
cool.
just only happens over time. That's the thing.
Yes. But the point is that teams need to be autonomous, self-managing, and self-optimizing to navigate change at pace. So everything that we've just talked about is how teams will be diverse. They'll have a growth mindset. They'll be um, uh, adapting to problems, failing, learning. Really important part of this is that all of this is within a team's control. It becomes their sphere of influence to be autonomous, to say, we are in control of what we do each day, how we work in order to solve the problems that we're looking to looking to solve. We'll be self-managing in the fact of we know who's on our team, how they contribute to the overall goals. And this is the most important part. How do we actually, when we don't see something right, how do we, or just maybe with something we can improve, something we can do better, how do we self-optimize to actually ride that exponential curve of change and of growth and value to the market?
Yeah, I completely agree.
Yeah.
And it's really focusing at the team, not the individual, because I think very often that can be a challenge that we have. I think our HR systems, our reward systems are very often,
I completely agree. And this is
maybe.
where the clash comes with HR, because I don't think in most organizations, the team is not assessed.
That's right.
It's the individuals who are assessed and the individuals who are compensated. Whereas it's a complete change saying, well, actually, no individual. This company does not live and die by individuals. It lives and dies by teams.
That's exactly right. And then that is in fact part of the reason why I believe something like comparative agility can be really useful, because it's all at the team level. We don't.
Hmm.
It's not doesn't mean that we don't care about the individual. We want the individual inputs, but at the end of the day, it's the team that is the sort of the lowest level of unit of actually value creation here. It's not about the individuals. It's about how those individuals become collaborative team members.
Hmm. And that kind of puts us nicely on the next slide of there's many things that in the space, well, in the agile space and traditional space, which are kind of touch upon this, but they all kind of don't quite get there. We just talked about HR systems. While I still believe there's much great value in individual appreciation, individual um, kind of feedback, it doesn't aggregate to a team level and doesn't help the team take on ownership of their future and of their diversity.
I think you're right, and that's what's starting to happen now. Is I think HR is recognizing that, so you can see a lot
Mm-hmm.
of change. You probably heard about agile HR is becoming a thing
Yes.
now. They're
Mm-hmm.
also recognizing that they need to up their game, which I think is wonderful. I think we're going to get a lot of great support and alignment from HR in the future. I was talking to one person. This is probably about 3 months ago. She was a head of HR for one company, and she got a new job, and what she was called was CTR. No, CTO was what she would call it. And I was thinking, CTO, is that Chief Technology Officer? And she said, no, I'm being called the Chief Transformation Officer. And I was like, whoa, that's great. And I was like, well, is that because you're not working in HR anymore? And she's like, no, that is that is the
That
role of
is
HR.
HR.
Yeah, that
Yeah,
is HR.
exactly.
Exactly. I am the Chief Transformation Officer because I am in HR. And I was like, that is awesome. And I think at the end of the day, this people is core to all of this, just like you said. And in HR, if they can't be part of that, like where should they be? So I
Yes.
think that's wonderful to see things like that.
Yeah. Then you've got traditional survey tools like your Survey Monkeys and all those kinds of things, which are really just blank slates. And I think the most important thing here is not the tool, but the method inside it, the the ideas and the way that you actually ask questions and things like that. So while this is still an option, it doesn't really take world's best practice and apply it in an easy to consume format.
It's true, and the thing about surveys that I'm now a lot more humble about is that creating a question isn't as easy as you might think,
No, it's
because you
not at
might not
all.
be measuring what you think you're measuring, and
Yep.
that can be really scary, and it can also waste a lot of people's time if crafting a good question and then later on being able to validate that that question actually measures what it's supposed to is actually something that data scientists do, and it's a
Hmm.
profession and it's a craft, and it's something that I think we may have taken a little bit lightly. I think SurveyMonkey is an excellent platform for creating surveys, but I also think it can be harmful if you use that um, without some intention. So yeah, it's
Hmm.
good to get some feedback, but I think we got to be careful with how you craft those questions and
Hmm.
what you do with them.
You hit it on the nail here. It's the actual question, which is important. Then we also have our retros, which while we love retros, are localized and sometimes forgotten. I mean, the team, I would always say that we're not saying that retros aren't necessary, because I believe they are, but how do you actually aggregate that data and also compare and see growth over time?
Completely agree. I mean, retrospectives are super important. I think if you think of some of the data that we've been able to do through comparative agility, actually found that retrospectives are absolutely positively correlated to uh, higher customer satisfaction, to more team productivity, and to team velocity. So
Hmm.
it's a really positive thing. Now that means that those retrospectives are done regularly, and also that action is being taken on those retrospectives. I
Yes.
think very often this becomes one of those ceremonies that people just kind of do, but they don't always take action on the outcomes of those retrospectives. And that can be, I think, a huge problem, because then it becomes more of a bitching session. It can be
Yeah.
frustrating, and it can actually be counterproductive. But retrospectives by themselves are really important. Problem is we probably don't take them seriously enough very often.
I agree. It sometimes seems like an afterthought in a lot of the cases, rather
Right.
than a core part of of what we do. Um, let's not forget. I mean, aside from retro items, you've got your actual day job to do as well.
That's right.
There's all those things that need to be done, all those stories that need to be written, or whatever it is that you do. But that's why I feel like without an actual, while I don't want to focus on tools too much, I think without the team being effectively resourced with tools or methods to take the burden of managing retros away, they'll be much more successful if they have something that helps them through that journey as well, but also provides much more comparative understanding of data over time. Because I mean, the way I see comparative agility sitting is actually on top of retros. You'll still do your retros every week or whatever your cadence is, but doing that actual collection of data every 3 months actually enhances the overall process.
Yeah, I think you're completely right. It's a complement to retrospectives, and it also gives you a bigger picture. So you can look at things at the team level, you can look at things at the program level, or even the organizational level. At the
Yes.
end of the day, it just gives you insights that you probably didn't have before, and
Mm-hmm.
that data, those kind of insights, is fuel to continuous improvement. It's really hard
Mm-hmm.
to do any type of improvement if you don't know what you're improving. And
Mm-hmm.
that's part of the challenge we have today. There's so many things you can focus on, and we know what happens if you focus on too many things. You just don't going to get anything done. So I think
Mm-hmm.
the one thing that we can try to do through meaningful data is to try to focus our efforts, kind of separate the signal from the noise, and just really do that really well. I think that's the beginning of great
I think that's a
implementation.
really good point also. Something that I often fear in retros is the psychological safety to actually say what I really mean.
Right.
And I do think that's understated, that the psychological safety there isn't always present. And then how would you know if it's not without some sort of other channel where people can be anonymously, if they want to, say what they really think? And I think that's where comparative agility can actually enhance that entire process by seeing if what we're seeing, what's coming out of people's mouths in person actually matches the anonymous data, which we're getting through another tool.
That's right, which is very agile. I mean, the thing that I love about agile is it doesn't necessarily solve your problems, but it makes them very visible. So
Yes.
once these problems are come out in the open, then it's up to us as professionals to deal with those problems. But Agile in itself doesn't solve your problems. They're still going to be
No.
there. They're just going to
No.
make them very visible. And it's similar
Hope.
with comparative agility.
Yeah. Hopefully, it just gets you on the path of the right problems, not
That's right.
just.
That's right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. So the way that we do this is by collecting the data, which was we're saying this is a very small part of, well, not a small part, but the beginning of the entire process. After that, you will find the narrative of what, stitch this together. We have seen this data over here, this data over here, and go around this whole cycle in order to actually take action. We'll just dive into this now. So the first step is to collect your data, which is where the tool comes into it.
That's right.
Now, go ahead. Sorry.
One thing I could do if you wanted to, I have one report that I can show you
I think
just
that's exactly what we need to do.
to give
Yeah.
an example. I'm not sure how that would work. Should I just take a
Just
screenshot of that,
share your
or
screen.
yeah,
No,
I can.
share your screen.
Let
Yeah.
me try that. Okay, let me see. How do I do that again? Share. Oh, here we go.
Yeah.
So let me see if that works, and then let's see if I can find my screen here. Good thing you're a good editor. Let's see here. I think this will work. And then you tell me if you can see my screen now.
Yes, there we are.
Okay. So what we see here is a very simple report. I just thought it would be nice to at least have an example so we can kind of go through it end to end.
Yep.
There's lots of other things you can do, but essentially what's happening here is that there's a team here, and this is actually real data. I've changed the name of the team though because they didn't want me to, to expose
Yes.
who they were, what company they were working for, but it's real data. This is a team, Team Dolphins from May 2018, who's comparing themselves from May to December 2017. So it's one team at two different points in time. And what you see here is every time that the team from May is indicating they're doing better, it's going to be positive. It's going to be above the zero. And it's going to be blue bars. So they're doing fairly well here. And every time they indicate they're doing worse, it's going to be negative, or in this case, sort of orange bars below the bar. And right off the bat you can get an idea what's going on. You can see that in most cases they're probably doing better than before, which is really positive.
Yeah.
That's
Mm-hmm.
a great thing. And you can look at a little spider graph to kind of get some perspective, and you can see if you unclink the world index, kind of look at the data set here for May 2018, you can see that, in most of these dimensions, they're doing quite well. Technical practices probably struggling a bit. Some issues probably with quality. You can overlay the world index, and you can see that they're doing better than the world index in most of these, but that's not so great here when it comes to technical practices and quality. If you overlay this, you could see that even though the world index is probably something they do better than, uh, world index is kind of a messy place. That's the truth of what's going on out there, which is sometimes ugly. So I wouldn't necessarily say that the world index is what you should strive for, but you can
Hmm.
see that in most cases they're actually doing better than what they did in 2017. So
Yeah.
positive overall. But that being said, there's certainly things that you can dig into here. And one of those, if you look at teamwork, there's quite a few things. You can zoom in a bit. Looks like in teamwork management, for instance, you see a couple of things stand out. Here's one statement here. Management sets goals, but doesn't tell team members how to achieve them. This is something where the team is indicating that compared to what they did in December 2017, this is no longer taking place. This is actually happening now at a less frequent rate than before. They're saying now
Hmm.
that management are now actually not just setting goals, they're actually telling people how to do their work, which we know is
Yeah.
sort of an anti-pattern.
Yeah.
So, let's say if you did this analysis, you can dig into this data and find all sorts of other things as well. You see there's some other things here, but for the sake of this exercise, how about we just went down and let's say we focus on this one first, and we said, all right, here we have an hypothesis. We can see that this is happening. It's standing out. If we look at, for instance, the average score, it's a low score, 2.71. That's a really low score on a 5-point scale. If we look at the distribution characteristics, I mean, look at this. This is a very wide bar, which tells
Yeah.
us that the team members really aren't agreeing with each other on this particular question. So, as a coach, this is probably something we should talk about a little bit deeper. So,
Yeah.
how does it look? Well, here's probably where we should go over to your slides, because now we know we have an hypothesis. Now we found the narrative, and we said, okay, what's starting to happen here is that the team is indicating that management is starting now to talk to teams about how they should do their work. They're not just setting the
Hmm.
goals as they have been doing to product owners and such. They're now starting to say, this is how you should do the work. Why is this
Yes.
happening? So here's where the other steps of that process start, and this is why this is so much about the process, about the conversations, about the individuals, and in the interactions, not so much about the tool. But we wouldn't even know this was a problem unless we had that tool.
And I just want to interrupt you for a second here, because this is the point at which it blew my mind a little bit, just to say, wait a minute, do we actually agree that this is actually a problem? And if we don't, why don't we agree? Um,
Exactly. Exactly.
it's and this is a part of, I'm not saying that all team members need to agree. We're talking about diversity before, but if we're not even talking about why we disagree on things, we're not aligned, as we talked about.
I think
We're
you're
we're
completely
loosely
right.
aligned. Yeah.
I think you're completely right, and I think that point, the idea that we're not agreeing here, which I think is what's happening, is that they have a wide range of opinions about that particular question, even though it's clear that the averages are low, and that compared to what they felt before, it's certainly lower. So we can see that there's a negative trend here. At the same point, we can see that they're not all agreeing with this statement. That, I think, is a really important point for coaches to be aware of. And that's where sort of starts that first activity, which we call a modified open space. Now, uh, modified open space in general is a relatively common agile technique. Typically the way an open space works is that you will propose a certain theme, and then if that's something people want to work on, then we actually create a session, and we start working on a certain team for a certain amount of time, and then we break up, and then we're done. It's very organic, and it kind of emerges over time. Anyone can propose a theme. It's really open. This is similar, except we call it modified open space because the theme here really is what we get out of that narrative. So think about what we just did earlier. We looked at that report, and we found out that management is now starting not only to set goals, but also telling us how to do the work. Now, what we're saying is, how about we make that a theme? If we find that that is one of the narratives that we see in our data, let's make that a
Hmm.
theme and then do a modified open space on that. And what we
Hmm.
try to do then is break that down into three sort of main discussions. The first being the what, which is what impediments are we seeing with this? So if you think about this, You're talking with your team. They're saying that management is now telling us how to do the work. What is the impediment? What kind of problems is that causing? And team members might say, well, I don't really feel empowered anymore. I feel that, my manager is now telling me what testing frameworks to use. They're telling me, what I should do next. I mean, it's just not really
Hmm.
empowering. So you can see customer engagement goes down, that kind of thing. Then you change the conversation, doing this through sticky notes or some other way to sort of get a lot of great feedback. You say, okay, so what is the impact of these impediments that we're seeing right now? Well, what does it mean to you as a team when you're seeing these things happening? And then they want to say things like, well, because management's telling me what to do, I'm actually not able to do my work done as fast as I usually do. I'm now having to compromise on quality. I'm having to do things that I know isn't right, but my manager tells
Hmm.
me to do it, and because I don't want to offend him or her, I do it anyway. Like these might be some of those things that come out of the so what conversation. And then
Yeah.
after that, we then follow that up with now what, and we say, all right, you told us what the impediments were. The data helped us highlight this. You told us about the impediments. You told us about the impact of those impediments, what that actually cost in the team, and what the negative implications were. And now we're saying, what can we do to address this? And then the team can come up with many ideas of how to solve that problem. It could be, you know what? I don't think management wants to do these things. I think they just didn't know better. I think maybe they need to get some
Hmm.
additional training. Maybe they need to understand the impact of what they're doing. Maybe if they understood that we still value them as managers just because they don't tell us what to do, maybe they feel like they're lost. Very often people get promoted because they are technical people and suddenly they become
Hmm.
managers. And now we say, well, now we don't want to hear your opinion anymore. That can be really tough for managers. So,
Yeah.
so all of these things can come up out of that discussion. The point being then is that the team now can be part of the solution. They can be part
Hmm.
of the solution together with the coach, so we can start forming a strategy for how we're going to address this impediment. So that's just one example of how you can have a very robust conversation, individuals and interactions, uh, all based on a couple of data points that you got out of that initial report.
And this is where the conversation opens. We're setting some context, getting uh, some information just around it. So it's not just data anymore. It's actually conversation and dialogue.
I like the way you say that. Yeah, what you're doing now is you're turning data into information. That's
Yeah.
essentially what's happening. You're putting humans into it. I think part of data. I mean, I love data. Don't get me wrong,
Yeah.
but data doesn't give you the why. Data doesn't
Yes.
tell you the why, and you need people for that. And that's why some people will say, oh, with comparative agility, do you even need coaches anymore? And I think absolutely, even more so do you need coaches, because who's going to help you make sense of this? That is the
Yeah.
coaches. That is where that's the secret sauce. This is just another tool for coaches to be able to have better conversations. I mean, they always say that comparative agility in itself doesn't give you the answers, but it helps you ask better questions.
I find that's a general rule of everything, that quantitative or qualitative, isolated, they're not helpful at all. It's the yin and the yang of everything that, you know, data needs conversations, and conversations need data in order to provide the whole picture.
I think you're completely right. I think you're doing yourself a disservice if you ignore the data, but I also
Hmm.
think you're doing yourself a huge disservice if you simply go with data alone. You need that combination of things. I think you're completely right. Context matters a lot here.
Hmm.
And that takes us to the next phase, what we typically do then. So let's imagine now you have comparative agility data, you had some really great conversations in a group setting. What we also now want to do is to have the opportunity to meet with people one-on-one. And I think this is important. It doesn't mean you meet with every single person. I think that might be a little too much. But
Hmm.
in my experience, if you do 15 or 20% of the sample set of whoever you're looking at, maybe it's a team, and in that case, you may meet with one or two people, or if it's a whole program, you may meet with maybe 10 or 15. The idea here is to give people a chance to meet one-on-one in a very safe environment where you say, okay, we're going to have this conversation. It's about 20 minutes. I'm not going to attribute your answers. I'm not going to say that Joe said this, but I
Yeah.
would like to just know more about how you feel about these results. What are some of the things that surprised you? What are some of the things you would like to change if you see something? Tell me about the challenges. Tell me about the things that's behind the data. This one is really interesting because very often you will hear things here that the data could not tell us. and that we couldn't hear in a group setting. It could be things that have to do with culture. It could be things that have to do with maybe managers who are doing things they shouldn't be doing. It could be personnel issues. It could be things that it's really hard to talk about that can come out in a personal setting like this.
Hmm.
And I think,
So,
yeah, go ahead.
so for this kind of one-on-one, you obviously want to get a broad range of data, right? So you get different roles in the team, different seniorities. Is
That's
that how
right.
it would work?
Ideally,
Yeah.
that's what you'd like to do. You like to try to get sort of a broad, let's say you do 15 or 20%, try to get a nice sample set that actually is representative of the entire data. So try to get some people who maybe been in a team for a long time, some junior
Mm,
people, people with different roles. You know, you try not to get too many managers necessarily in this situation because
mm,
the managers aren't typically part of the team, but at least try to get a nice little broad perspective so you have that diversity represented also in those one-on-ones.
mm.
It can be
Uh,
really
uh,
interesting, especially when you do open-ended questions here, just to kind of hear what they have to say. I think very often
mhm.
people aren't asked these questions, to be honest. I mean, very often we
Yes.
we just don't we don't take the time to ask, and I think having that opportunity can be really useful for a lot of people.
Yeah, I've been in kind of situations like this where you actually do ask people what they think, and it doesn't stop because
Yeah,
no
right.
one's ever asked them.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, and in
Yeah.
this case, remember we're not promising anything at this point. All we're saying is that we want to hear. We want to hear what you
Hmm.
think, not telling you that I can do anything about it at this point, but this becomes part of our
Yes.
fact-finding process. And then we will take action ultimately, but this doesn't mean that I can solve all your problems right now.
And this is something that I when I coaching teams on retros as well, it's like just because we put all the post-it notes up on the wall does not mean we're going to do all of them. What we're really looking for is high value, really important items. And at this point, we're in the journey of we're just still gathering that data and understanding, maybe starting to get some understanding of the weight of each of these items. But we certainly can't promise we're going to do anything about them because we need to focus our energy.
That's right. Yes, work in progress is key for us also. Just like the team shouldn't do too many things at once, same thing
Hmm.
for us as change agents.
Yes.
If we do too many things, we're just simply not going to get anything meaningful done. So we do need to take that time and be able to prioritize it. And that's again where the data helps us tell us where the teams are really concerned. They have lots of concerns, but
Exactly.
there's some that
Coming
shine
back
up.
to That's exactly it. Coming back to what we are saying, you can't have one without the other. Just talking one-on-one, it's hard to get uh, I don't want to use the word severity, but the impact of that across the team. Unless you interviewed everyone, that's the
That's
thing.
right.
Or you interview just the most emotional, loudest voices in the room. You need to back it up with that data to see how important this is.
Exactly. No, I completely agree.
Hmm.
This one is nice too. I always like to combine. I mean, it comes back to sort of that diversity of data. Like you have subjective data through comparative agility, you have really rich data through these group activities, and then you get very personal, deep data through these one-on-ones. Here's objective metrics. Here's data that's relevant to your business context, to your
Hmm.
team, to your organization, but it's completely objective. Ideally, this is data that's automated, the data that isn't affected or gamed in any way. Lead time is one of those things that are hard to game. Flow
Yep.
efficiency, mean time to build recovery. These are all very, I think, really useful metrics that you can
Yep.
combine together with this and say, all right, we start to see what's happening here. Now let's do a baseline and start to see what the impact might be to our business. Are we delivering faster because of this, or is our quality going down? There's
Hmm.
all sorts of negative implications that teams not working together has. So it's important for us to start tracking that.
Hmm. I think this is really, really important because just in the previous one-on-ones, as I said, when people are asked, it can be much, this is how I feel.
Hmm.
But we're not saying those feelings, everyone's feelings are important, but do they match the objective reality? And if not, that's going to guide you in a certain, if it does, or if it does not, it's going to guide you in a certain way of, well, why are people feeling this way? Or, well, actually they're pointing to a very real problem that we're seeing in the realistic metrics.
Yeah, you're right. And sometimes, and this is where those organizations that take this seriously get some benefits because not all metrics are created equal. Some of these metrics are
Yes.
leading metrics and some are lagging metrics. I think
Hmm.
comparative agility is very often a leading metric. Like if you see things, you see the company or the organization is not happy with things, you see engagement scores go low, you see that teams are perceiving that the quality isn't great, then if you look at the objective metrics, the quality might actually look quite good. That doesn't mean you should sort of take the foot off the pedal or of the metal. You might
Yes.
actually look at this and say, you know what, I might want to track this because I am now worried that those quality metrics will go down. Because if
Yep.
teams are saying they're not feeling good about quality, it probably means something. It probably means
Hmm.
that objectively that quality is about to go down. But as you
Yes.
know, quality scores, it might take several months before you see that in production.
Hmm. It's really coming back to what we were talking about before. If you see a disparity, there's a story there. There's
Hmm.
something going on that you need to is a part of reconciling and understanding what's going on inside the organization.
That's exactly right. It is that invitation to a conversation, and we can say, what is happening here? Why is this not meshing? Uh,
Yeah.
is it that we are misunderstanding the question? Is it that we think we're better than we are, or worse than we are, or what's happening? And I think very often having those very honest conversations can be really meaningful because it really is exposing things that's there. There's sort of that elephant in the room that now suddenly
Hmm.
comes up, and I think the sooner we can address it, the better. Because the thing is, if we didn't do these surveys, it doesn't mean these things wouldn't happen anyway, right?
Yes.
It's
Yeah.
still happening. It's just that now we
Yes.
can expose it and do something about it.
And I love that these are all different kinds of information, different kinds of data, because it's that coming back to that old thinking problem of what does an elephant look like to each person touching
That's
it.
right.
We're not going to see the whole problem until we get all these different types of data.
That's exactly right. And that's why I think it's so important to have people be a central part of this. Also those four pieces, comparative agility, having the objective metrics, the group activities and those individual conversations, half of that is just conversations. You need to
Hmm.
have those conversations, but they're targeted and they're intentional conversations. They're not just sort of, hey, tell me how things are going. They're actually based on the data that we already have. So we know where to shine the light. We know where the
Hmm.
issues might be, so we can have more targeted conversations rather than just kind of like, hey, tell me how things are, because that can be, it can be a lot of noise when you do that.
But collecting all this data and having all these conversations can actually create a level of expectation, which is why it's important to actually do something about it.
Yes, and that's a great segue because at the end of the day, if we do these things and we don't do anything, then you can actually do a lot of harm. And I
Yes.
think that could be detrimental to agility because at the end of the day, agile is a very sort of empirical process, which means yes, we expose the issues. Okay, now do something about it. That's
Yeah.
ultimately what this is about, and that's what we do here
Hmm.
too. The data helps us have better conversations. We now can start to see where we're having challenges. We can now devise strategies and take actions to address this. But if we don't do anything, then forget it. And this goes back to what you were saying about the WIP, the work in progress. Don't
Yep.
do too much at once. I
Hmm.
strongly encourage people to focus on one or maybe two things and then communicate that to leadership because, in one way or the other, especially if this is worth doing and if it's something that's bigger than just, let's improve our story point estimations, which teams can do by themselves, then you're going
Hmm.
to need some leadership help, either in
Yes.
terms of funding or in terms of organizational support. And you say, hey, Mr. or Mrs. Leader, here's what the teams are telling me. Here's what the data is telling me. Here's what I'm finding while looking at both of these. I'm going to need your help for this. Either it's going to be a financial commitment or an organizational commitment. Either way, I need your backing. Because this is gonna entail some change. If it
Yes.
didn't, then you really wouldn't make any difference. So that's really important. And then the second part, then once you have that support, is to communicate that broadly and tell the teams, hey, here's what we're doing. This is why we're doing it. You told us this. This is why we're making the changes we're making. Thank you for your feedback. And oh yes, we do take it seriously. And then show progress. If you're having some bumps in the road, which probably is likely if you're making real change, then be
Yep.
honest about that too. And I think the teams will actually respect you for it.
Yeah, I can't underline this enough because I think honestly this is the point at which trust is broken or
Yes.
earned. Because I've seen it you see almost this in every little retro is where the team will tell you, well, we need to change this, we need to change this will really help us. 2 weeks later, someone comes back and hasn't done anything about it. Like, well, what's the
Right.
point?
Yes.
It's learned helplessness in some respects.
Absolutely. I think you're so right about this. This is the thing. This is where the rubber hits the road. This is where all that analysis you've done, all those conversations you've had, none of this mean anything unless you take action. And now it doesn't mean you have to solve all the problems. And that's the thing. I think people get overwhelmed sometimes
Yes.
because they have so much data and insights now, and they say, "Oh, great, we can change the world." Sure, but let's start with the things that is the most important in the eyes of the team, and that our data can support. And let's just really do that end to end. Let's
Hmm.
make that a strategic initiative. Whether it takes us 3 months to 6 months doesn't matter, but let's do it. And then actually let's be open about it so that people can see what we do. And if we're not making
Hmm.
progress, yeah, okay, let's tell the teams that and say, here's why we're not making progress on, and this is why.
Completely agree. Yeah.
That's so key. And this goes back to that culture part we talked about earlier about growth mindset. We talked about, psychological safety and those kind of things. If we are not able to be open about our safety here, right, and our
Hmm.
failures, then how can we expect teams to be? So this is where we
I
can
agree.
model that behavior.
Yeah, and especially, yeah, I think that point about, look, if we thought we were going to do something about it, but we can't, be very open and honest about that, because just going silent, something's going to happen regardless of what you do. So you want to make sure that you at least make it a learning part of your values and culture, that if you're hitting budget constraints, or there's, for some reason, it's not the best time to do this right now, just be open on it. Because I've seen plenty of people who just go, who say, well, okay, this is, if I can't deliver, if I can't provide the expected outcome, it's not worth pursuing to the end. But my advice there would be, no, there's more to be gained from being open, transparent, and trusted, than to just being right all the time.
I think you're completely right. That's it's gonna say so much to the teams, and they're
Yeah,
gonna trust you a lot more. And ultimately, if
correct.
you're a change leader, trust is sort of your biggest capital. You need people to
Hmm.
trust you, and you need to be open and honest with them. So I completely agree with you. And to be fair, I mean, I think they also recognize that what you're trying to do here, you know, is large change. I mean, if
Hmm.
this was something they could do themselves, they probably would already have done it. So
Yes.
they recognize these are not simple problems. So they're going to give you some slack, but what they won't do is to just let you go silent and not say anything. And I think as long as you're open about it, of course, this is where that organizational support is going to be important. If leaders also understand that this is important, then the chances of you making some progress over time is going to increase.
Hmm. Okay, cool. Now, uh, one of the points that we made before about writing good questions, I think that's the first point here. Um, these names are pretty big deals, and experts in their field.
Yeah, I think it comes down to, part of what I'd like to kind of point out about this is that the results, you can have some confidence in the results of these surveys. I think you can feel good about that. But at the end of the day, it is the change leaders, the coaches who rule. They are
Hmm.
the ones who actually make this change. Uh,
Hmm.
the points I wanted to make first about the surveys themselves is that they are created by people that we respect. Mike Cohn and Kenny Rubin, Amy Edmondson. I mean, these are people who are thought leaders in their field. And I think it would be silly for us to think that we can come up with better questions than them simply.
Yep.
I mean, it doesn't mean that we can't, but I wouldn't spend my life trying to match all of these people and their
Yes.
life's work, because not only have they done this for many, many years, they've also proven it through research, and they've been able to scientifically validate that these questions actually measure what they're supposed to measure. So it's
Hmm.
kind of silly for me to come up with my own questions for all of these things. Now, what I love to do is to do a combination. Like I take the best of these people for what they do really well. And if there's something that's really specific to my organization, I can come up with my own statements. Nothing wrong with that. But I
Yes.
wouldn't just throw anything that Dr. Amy Edmondson does on psychological safety, throw that out and pretend that I can come up with my own statements. I think that would
Hmm.
be silly. And the other part of it is the quality of the surveys. What we're looking at there is validity, which is it measuring what it's supposed to, and also reliability. Can you expect these reliable results every time, so that you don't get confused and surprised every time you do it? And what you do in comparative agility, which all survey tools that are serious about this should be doing, is that you use a certain format in terms of survey design. So we have data scientists who kind of go through that and make sure that the statements are phrased in a certain way that they're not very easily confusing. And the second part is to do statistical analysis on it and then measure the relative efficacy or validity of the particular statement. And you can do that through statistical psychometrics, which are some of those tools that we use. And then when we see that certain statements aren't valid, then we take them out or we revise them. But the statements you see in those that are not beta, because that's what we label those surveys that are not haven't gone through this yet, that those we can say with confidence are actually measuring what they're supposed to measure. So that's good. But then it comes down to the third part, and that's the hard work. It doesn't give you the answers. It helps you
Yes.
ask better questions, but at the end of the day, it's about the coaches doing the hard work. This is not a shortcut. It just says, okay, there's a lot of stuff going on here. Here's probably where you want to focus first, and this is why.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's up to the customers and the coaches to actually make the change.
Yeah. I'm not sure I completely agree with you about not being a shortcut, because I think it just helps you. It helps you get to the good stuff.
No, you're right. You're right.
Typically, it could have taken months upon months to do surveys in this kind of way, write questions, and then even make sure they're valid, etc. But that's not where the value happens, as we've just said, right?
No.
If I can actually take a tool, send it out, have results back from the team within a day or two, that's when I can actually start doing the good stuff. Not
You're right.
6 weeks getting to that point.
It certainly is a shortcut in that sense, but it's not a shortcut in
Yes.
it doesn't make you agile by just taking comparative
Yes.
agility. Like you still have to do the work.
We agree. Exactly.
But no,
but I think that's the
completely
that's the core value from which an agile coach or any sort of change engine brings their value. So we're helping you get to your value quicker.
Yes, I completely agree. And this is why I think it's such an important role. I have a lot of respect for agile coaches. I have a lot of respect for scrum masters. These are people that sometimes people say, what do they do? They don't write code necessarily. Well, no, they might not write code, but they're the ones that's actually going to help you as an organization be more agile, because teams and individuals by themselves very quickly are bumping up against the system. It's the system that is what's preventing these people from delivering awesome value, and that system needs to be actively taken on, and they can't do that themselves. You can't expect team members who are busy working on a backlog to say, now go ahead and change the system. They don't have the organizational power to do it. They don't have the cycles to do it. They're stressed out with their current backlog. This is where coaches can come in and say, you know what, this is where I can help remove those impediments to agility.
Yes, I agree. And then for me, personally, comparative agility was that missing piece where I could actually start creating those conversations which will really drive change inside the organization and create that culture of continuous improvement.
Oh, hey, thank you. I feel the same way. I mean, I used it myself when I was an organizational coach at Nokia and at Intel, and later on at McAfee. I used comparative agility all the way, and it's not that it wasn't so much the tool as it was the quality of the questions. I think it was my colleague Kenny Rubin that I give all the credit to. I mean, the way they phrased those questions, they were right on. It was one of those questions that just, you knew that, when you look at that question, you can say, okay, there is a clear sort of short-term gain from that question, but then you realize there was much deeper things that came out of that question later on that I didn't realize in the beginning. I talked to a customer actually who said he had a whole retrospective on one single question. So that kind of tells you how some of these things can really unleash a lot of great conversations.
But while they seem simple, they're not easy. These questions have come from, as you've said, literally decades of experience.
That's true. That's true. Yeah, they were first created in 2008, and then I know that they went through a massive statistical analysis. They had 120 questions originally, and then they went through a statistical analysis. This was from North Carolina University, and then after Laurie Williams was the professor who did that analysis. After going through that, she was able then to recognize those statements that actually made a difference and those who did not, and she was also able to get rid of those statements that were confusing. To kind of follow her statistical level. And now we're down to about 66 statements. And you could choose if you don't want to use all of them. But I think as a start, as a baseline, having those 8 dimensions, I think could be a really useful place to start.
Awesome. Now, I love this slide. The question is, are you ready for this? Are you ready for this change? Are you ready for this honesty?
This is true. This is scary. I mean, this is one of those things where I do talk to organizations sometimes that are very, very top down and really don't want to necessarily hear the bad news. And this
Hmm.
is where I have to tell them that, comparative agility is going to definitely help you shine a light on things. But if you don't have an environment where people can feel comfortable talking about these things, if you can't speak up, if you don't feel like you can say, you know what, this is not working, then whatever efforts you do are going to be very short term in nature. They're not
Hmm.
going to be sustainable. You're not going to create that culture unless you create that environment where you are actually open to change and open to hearing sometimes uncomfortable news. And that's the caution of this, which kind of leads to this next slide, which is really all about
Mm.
psychological safety, because that underpins a lot of this.
The thing I talk about with people, though, when it comes to this, is the old phrase, no pain, no gain.
That's
Without
right.
change, change is painful and change is uncomfortable, but that's the point of it, and that's why we do it.
That's right.
So, as we said at the beginning, we've got to be comfortable with being uncomfortable, but it takes more than just saying it. You got to feel it as well.
You're right, and it can be very uncomfortable for for managers often, because I think managers feel that they do have a certain an added responsibility here,
Yeah.
and that's probably true. And then when they hear from their team members or from their the people that they work with that they're not happy with the way things are, that they are pointing out all these areas of improvement, that can be uncomfortable, especially if you didn't know about this. Maybe this wasn't very clear, maybe this wasn't articulated before, and then you can feel that, oh, things are great, I'm doing awesome. Now suddenly you're hearing that it wasn't as great as you always thought it was, and that can be a little bit uncomfortable. I totally understand that, but like you said, at the end of the day, that is part of what we do here, to be comfortable with continuously changing the way we work.
Mm-hmm. And that is, I mean, the term is psychological safety. And here you've got a quote from Amy Edmondson. Psychological safety is a belief that one will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes.
Yes, this sounds maybe obvious to some degree, but honestly, it is so powerful. And
Yeah.
it's not just the humiliation, like, oh, that's a silly idea, things like that, but it's also the punishment that people will
Mm-hmm.
say, hey, that's that guy once again saying this and that, and let's just ignore what he or she has to say. Let's make sure that that person doesn't come up for promotion next time. Let's label that person as not a team player. I mean, you've probably heard all these phrases before, but that's things that organizations will do sometimes. If you're one of those people that speak up, you might be shut down in many different ways. They can ridicule you, they can punish you, but what it does is very nefarious and very harmful, because it makes it so that others who see this will then not speak up and rather just keep quiet. There's a recent case that we've heard a lot about now, is the Boeing case. The Boeing Max.
Mm-hmm.
This is a classic example of a lack of psychological safety, because there were many people, and they found this now through the investigation, many people in the lower chains here that saw the issues happening with that particular software and the way it wasn't handling that situation really well, but they didn't feel that they could speak up. They didn't feel like they
Yeah.
could say something, because they didn't feel safe. They didn't feel like that was appropriate in that environment. So they rather just kept quiet and let this happen. And of course, that ultimately ended up costing, several hundred people's lives. So
Yeah.
this is not a small thing, and especially in knowledge work, especially in complex environments like we work in, this is
Yes.
this is absolutely crucial.
Yeah. And it's uh, it's important to understand, though, that there can be different perspectives from where you sit inside the organization. So, I mean, when you have this culture where someone can be punished or humiliated, etc. I mean, from the management perspective, it could be saying, "Oh, this person is going rogue and taking the team off on a certain, basically trying to make the team unsuccessful, taking them on a different journey." But that's certainly not the case. You've got to have a very optimistic view of the world, that creating that safety, say when people will not misuse this ability to speak up and be a part of the conversation. We have to trust everyone to have an equal stake inside what we're talking about here, and then they'll bring the best forth.
Yeah, having good intentions and being open when
Mm-hmm.
you're making mistakes. I think part of the reason she came up with this research, this was actually done back in the late 90s, what Dr. Amy Edmondson was studying was hospitals. She
Mm-hmm.
done most of her work in the healthcare industry, and what she found is she was looking at, the way you look at success in terms of whether or not you're successful as a hospital, especially if you think of surgery. It's really, death rate is one thing that come up, but also
Yep.
the rate of return, essentially. So once a patient comes out of surgery, uh, what is the rate of which that person comes back again shortly
Yep.
thereafter? Because if the
Mm-hmm.
surgery is successful, you don't have to come back. And what she found, and that really surprised her, is that she was looking at these hospitals and she saw that in with, with those hospitals that actually had the best outcomes made the most mistakes. And
Oh.
she thought that was really strange. She's like, what's going on? She had to go through this, and she crunched the numbers several times, and she realized that when it comes to mistakes, such as maybe there were certain things dropped, or there was a wrong dosage done at a certain point in time, or there was lots of little mistakes that were more frequent among those hospitals and those teams that had the best outcomes. And she was saying, "What? How is this possible?" And what she found after digging into it was that, of course, everyone makes mistakes, but it was the
Mm-hmm.
hospitals with a larger degree of psychological safety who felt comfortable reporting it. So those other
Ah.
hospitals who had the worst rates in terms of death rates and really serious negative outcomes, they also made mistakes. They just didn't report it because
Mm.
they just kept quiet. So
Mm-hmm.
these other hospitals who actually did really well, they made mistakes. Nobody's flawless. Psychological safety doesn't mean that you don't make mistakes, but it makes it so that you can actually speak up, you can report on it, you can take action on it, and you can improve based on it.
Yes.
And that's what those hospitals were doing, and that's why they were making more mistakes, on paper, than those who simply weren't reporting it at all and just keeping quiet.
Mm-hmm.
So I
If you
think
don't know
that's
there's a
really important.
problem, yeah, if you don't know if there's a problem, you can never find a solution.
Exactly, it's exactly right, and it takes me back to an example I use in the book, which is when I was looking at the Toyota plant in Indiana, and I remember going through that plant. They were doing lift trucks, and it was for me a really great environment because I'm kind of a nerd when it comes to lean and agile and things like that. It's kind of walking
Yeah.
through the Toyota plant felt like
Yeah.
nirvana for me. And then I was talking to the chief engineer, and I was asking about defects and how he sort of treated those. And he was saying, we're kind of, kind of smiling at me in a funny way. And he was saying, we're kind of thinking of calling these defects treasures. And I said, oh, treasures? Okay, that's funny. I mean, is that kind of like the way we used to call bugs features? Is that what you're doing?
Yeah.
And he said, no, it's nothing like that. We actually call them treasures because these defects are giving us information against our system that we did not know about. And these defects are telling us, here's something that's wrong. And if you take those defects seriously and you fix them and you find the root cause of them, that system will now be much, much better than before. So that defect is a gift. It's a treasure. It helps us make a better system. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that was such a great way of looking at defects and looking at how he sort of embraced those defects, those errors, if you will, those mistakes. It was actually viewed as a positive thing that we could get those exposed, get them out there, deal with them so they don't have to happen again. And then as a result of that, we have a much better system rather than putting it under the carpet, pretending it's not there,
Yes.
ultimately then until it blows up.
I like that mindset that inside every defect there's an improvement, which means eventually more value.
That's right. It's a treasure. And of course, it's only a treasure if you actually take that defect seriously and fix the
Correct.
root cause of it. Now, if you just
Mm-hmm.
look at the defect and say, oh, that's a defect, and then keep moving, that's a different story. But again, if you feel empowered to make those changes so that that defect doesn't occur again, then that's learning, which is, of course, what this is all about.
Mm-hmm. And there's some very specific ways that Amy seems to set out for that.
Yeah, she writes several books on this actually, so I don't want to try to dumb it down too much, but just to kind
Mm-hmm.
of make it very simple. I mean, you should definitely read her books. I highly recommend that. But in sort of very high level views, part of what she starts with is leading by example, and I think that's hard for us sometimes. We say, oh, psychological safety. Why don't we just all feel that way and say these things?
Yep.
But it has to start with the leader because the
Yep.
leader is the person with the power. The leader is the person who has to make the first move. So I always encourage the leader to do that. Now that's what Dr. Edmondson is talking about here, to lead by example. That means that leaders
Mm-hmm.
also needs to be the one acknowledging mistakes. She talks about active listening, not just kind of sitting there and listening, but also thinking of something else. Actually ask more questions. I think it goes very much in line with what we're doing with comparative agility. When you have those conversations, what you're doing is active listening. You're indicating something through the data. Now let's understand what that means and listen to what's happening below the data. And then the whole idea of creating that environment where people they can speak freely without being interrupted. We don't have to judge people. We can assume good intent, like you said earlier. I think those things are really important. Not just think that people are there saying things because they want to be irritating or difficult. And then
Mm-hmm.
this whole idea of open mindset. This goes back to diversity. It goes back to receiving feedback, not thinking that, oh, I know what this person is doing. He's attacking me. This is more about, okay, how can we get this feedback from another team or from other people without looking at this as a personal criticism, but rather a way to improve. So I think that's really key. And I think data can help us here because it helps us take away some of the subjective part of it. When you're looking at average scores and when you look at how you're comparing to yourself at different points in time, I think that can maybe make it a little less emotional. And you can say, all
Mm-hmm.
right, here's what the data tells us. How do you feel about that? Then you can put the emotion into it rather than, let me give you some feedback. I think that can be very, very powerful sometimes. And I just want to point out that we do have her survey, the one that she used in her
Mm-hmm.
research. It is on comparative agility right now, so you can check it out for yourself. You can try it on your team and even on your organization. And this is exactly the same survey she used in those hospitals. So I think that's a really
Oh,
powerful
wow.
thing to do. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's her original research from 1999. So again, been tested. This has been this has been validated many years over. So I wouldn't recommend you create your own, but use the one that's there, and then look at that and see how your teams are performing, because that can tell you a lot of. I think that can give you a lot of insights.
Yeah, and I think the data can really, even just at the very basic level, like if people aren't, you can walk into a room and go, do we have psychological safety? You're going to make it a very different result when you actually anonymously ask those people via a data tool, whether it's a
Yes.
comparative agility or anything else. I
Yes.
think, again, that could be the start of your journey.
That's exactly right. I've done this many times in leadership workshops, for instance. I sometimes do have them do it in real time. I had a leadership workshop with about 25 oil executives, and they did this survey, and it was scary because they were kind of feeling pretty good about themselves and how they were working together. But once we looked at the survey, we saw that not only did they have a relatively low average in trust, but also when we looked at the way they disagreed with each other, we saw that they had a hard time actually being open with each other around criticism. They didn't
Hmm.
feel comfortable bringing bad news up to each other, and that's a good thing to know about, so you can address it, because ultimately, if you don't do that, we know that leads to bad things.
And that was one of the aha moments for me when I was using the tool, was like, you can't argue with these results. They're from your people. They're
That's
not
right.
subjective.
That's right.
I did.
Yeah, we're not making it up.
Yeah.
No,
This is from the horse's mouth. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. We know that the statements are valid because they've been backed by research. We know that we've gone through the math and that part. That's valid. Now it's just about what people feel, and this is what people feel. So then, are we going to ignore that? Then
Yes.
that's where we need to, that's empiricism. We got to actually take that data to heart, and then it's up to us to see what we want to do about it.
Okay. So the next step, uh, we're kind of coming to the end.
Yeah. I thought, at the end of the day, this is probably what our conversation is about. We agree that change isn't optional. This is not something we can do because we may feel like it. I don't
Hmm.
think we have a choice anymore. I think agility and agile, continuous improvement, these are things that is just part of business. I think if you think that that's something you can do as an optional thing, something you shouldn't take very seriously, then I question whether or not you're going to survive. I think it is, was it Darwin who said something like survival. What did he say? He said survival isn't mandatory. It's like
Yeah.
it's up to you whether or not you want to
Yeah.
continue to improve. Because if you choose not to, the option is there for you.
Yeah.
So I
Well,
think
the choice will be made for you whether you make the choice or not.
that's right. That's exactly
Yeah.
right. So we talked about culture. I think you brought us some slides there earlier, and I think that's really important. At the end of the day, I think the creating that culture is something that leaders need to take.
Hmm.
They take a responsibility in that sense, and I think the data is just one of those things, one of those inputs that can help us guide that transformation. I think it can accelerate things. You can be more intentional. I think that's what your point was about the shortcut. It can really, it can accelerate those conversations more
Yes,
quickly than if you just
absolutely.
kind of willy-nilly go in there. And
Yeah.
again, it's not about getting answers out of this. It's about those conversations. Got to make it safe so people can express their opinions. And then this quote here at the end is actually something I got from Mike Cohn. He says, "Agile is not something you become; it's something you become more of." And I think that's a beautiful way to say it. It's a continuous improvement process. It's not a destination, like you said earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. It's you can't underline this enough, because people do feel like, oh, we can tick this box and suddenly we're now agile. It doesn't work like that. It's going to be something that, as a part of the exponential curve of technology, consumer taste changes, globalization, there's always going to be more to learn, more to grow.
Exactly, and then this is why we have been trying to avoid maturity models. I think very often people say, "Oh, can't you translate comparative agility into a maturity model?" And then you can say, "Now we're awesome. Now we're agile." And I really work against that, because it's not that simple. It's not like you can say, "All right, you're now checking these boxes and you're agile and done." It's just not that way. And you can always improve the way you work, and it's a continuous journey. And it's not as simple as just saying, here, you're excellent. And I also think when people use these different terms, sometimes they'll say, walk, crawl, run, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
I think that could be a little bit insulting for companies who might be in a crawl state. You know what? They may be as agile as they can be at that point, and that doesn't mean they're crawling. It means they're a successful company at their stage in their journey, and where they go next is up to them. I don't think it's fair for us from outside to tell them that you're not agile. I mean, if they're more agile today than they were yesterday, in my book, they're agile. They're on that journey then.
I've had this conversation many times, and in my courses, I've said the same, very similar thing. It's not, the question is not, are we agile? The question is, how agile can we be?
That's right. Exactly. Are you more agile today than you were yesterday? Back to that statement that Mike Cohn made. That is the essence of agility, and it's not about whether you're in a certain stage or not. And I think that's something that people have a hard time sometimes grasping, because they want these simple answers where you can just sort of say, okay, here's where we are. This is the magic, and we're done. Or it's just not that simple.
So based on this talk, hopefully people are a little more agile tomorrow than they were today, by all the information that we've been giving them. And the next step that we'd really recommend is just to sign up for an account at Comparative Agility. Comparative Agility. It's hard to get in one mouthful, but there's a free account to start with. You can try out all of these surveys, see what works right for you, and start that journey.
Yeah, no, I would strongly encourage you to try it out. And it's one of those things, like you said, it's free. So, you can try it for up to 5 collectors without costing you anything. And then you can see if you find value out of it. And I think
absolutely,
we've been trying to make it very agile, in the sense that, if companies want to try a pilot or something like that, it's completely free as well. And the thing that I have found is that there's not a single company who's actually done this who has said that, it wasn't worth it, I don't know, $240 a year to do this. Because if you make a single change, you already paid for the tool many times over. And that those insights that come from that data in itself is worth it. So yeah, I totally think it's worth it.
I believe it's what the missing tool inside any agile team's framework. You've usually got your task management tool, whether it's Jira or Pivotal Track or whatever it is, but there's no tool the team really has for managing and improving team health and continuous improvement. I really feel this is the missing piece.
No, thank you. I think I'm glad you like it. I certainly have found it to be useful in my career. I was a client before I became part of this, so I'm a big fan.
Yeah, me too. And if people want to learn a bit more about the 5 pillars that we were talking about before, we only really lightly got into 2 of them, but I'd highly recommend you pick up George Jorgen's book. It's the book I use. I've recommended to every single person that I've taught agility or agile transformation to, and it's pretty much available everywhere.
I think it is, and thank you for saying that. That means a lot, Simon. It took me 2.5 years to write that thing. What I can say, it's an honest and sometimes maybe too honest account of an insider's perspective. I really tried to not look at this as a consultant, because I wasn't a consultant when I wrote it. I was an insider, and I was sort of kind of tired of people coming from the outside telling me how easy this should be. And I wanted to sort of say, okay, for all those people that are in the middle of a transformation or about to start a transformation, I wanted to give them very practical ideas of how this actually works from the inside. So that's who this is for. Any change leader, whether it's an executive or a team member or a program manager or an agile coach, how this works from your perspective, and then taking a lot of examples from colleagues from other organizations too, and try to find some patterns that might be helpful.
I think it's important. The thing that I got out of it most was agile transformations, or whatever you're going to call it, can often take multi-years, multiple failures, multiple horizons, as people call them. Trying to jam those 5 years of learnings, let's say, into a couple hundred pages is extremely valuable, because you get that bird's eye view of what's going to happen, what to expect, all the different areas you're going to touch on. Yes, you'll be able to bite off one chunk at a time, but at least you have that understanding of the map of the region. You can decide where to go from there.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. And I try to spend some time outlining a lot of the resources that I used, because there's only so much you can do in one book. But I wanted to say, okay, here's the key resources that I was consulting as I was going through this. And so I outlined them there as well. I mean, we all stand on the shoulders of giants here. And
Yes,
so I try to
absolutely.
really highlight that, because there's a lot of great literature out there, but buying all those books once, it can be very overwhelming. So I think it's good to kind of have something to start with, and then you can pick and choose which you want to dig deeper into.
Awesome. Well, it's been a fantastic time. Really appreciated you taking the time to talk with us, Jorgen. Just anyone out there who's listening right now, get in contact on LinkedIn if you have any further questions. We're happy to talk, ask questions, meet, whatever. But the most important thing here is to keep the conversation going. And thank you for your time, Jorgen.
Oh, thank you, Simon. This was great. It was kind of felt like we were sitting in a bar having a beer, and which I love.
Yeah.
So this was a lot of fun. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Well, fly to Oslo and we can do that for real.
Yeah, I love that idea very much.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Okay, thank you.